Welcome to Product AMA, your daily online Ask Me Anything. We started Product AMA to give those passionate or curious about product management a daily break, something to look forward to.
So our topic today is all about execution and how to get stuff done. And joining us to explore this topic is Amber Foucault, who is the VP product at Sensibill. Now, Amber has launched over 70 products, and her specialty is overcoming limitations from legacy systems, budgets, operational hurdles by creating strategy and momentum to get stuff done, to execute. Amber, thank you so much for joining us at Product Ask Me Anything.
Thank you for having me.
Great, great. Well, let's get started right away. And I usually like to start with a little bit of background on your journey into product management. So I understand you started your career in advertising with some of the big names like Publicis and Ogilvy and Mather before moving into product management at Intersect. Can you tell us a little bit about that transition to product management and why you did it?
Yeah, I think way back when I graduated, I didn't actually even know what product management was. I mean, this was like early 2000s, and there was something that was really attractive back then about the advertising industry. It had sort of lost some of the flair of the 70s and 80s and kind of early 90s, but there was something really interesting about being the person that was obsessed about the consumer that I always found fascinating in the advertising ecosystem. So I started on the account side of advertising, which basically meant I was the liaison between the client and the creative teams. And then I eventually merged over into strategy. And strategy allowed me to sort of focus on one particular insight. And the goal of that insight was finding a way into a consumer's life and being able to use that as a wedge to get the brand inside of there. And so I enjoyed it. I got to work on some amazing brands with some incredibly talented creative teams. And then I think there was a part of me that as I moved into more and more digital products that really wanted to shift that to individual users. So really take what I had been learning on the consumer side and what happened when I spun those insights around into more user-focused insights and how could I use those for digital products. So, part of it was really organic to, land me inside of product management. But part of it kind of felt like I'd been training the whole time on the advertising side to make my way over to product management, because the strategy component and learning how to really think and isolate strategic information and decisions and insights became very, very valuable very quickly.
And had technology always been of interest to you? Had you been involved in that part of the industry in the advertising business?
I was. I don't know if I initially entered that part by choice. The sexiest part of advertising is TV, and it always was. And things definitely started to change by about 2009, 2010. There was a lot more digital momentum in terms of brands really leaning in on the digital side of things. But I would lie if I said I was just naturally drawn to that technology side out of interest. When I eventually ended up going over to B Notions, which eventually saw itself through 2 acquisitions, but that was my first foray into product management. When I landed there, I had to take CSS classes and HTML, and I had to really immerse myself and start ground up. So not so that I could code, nobody wants me to code, but just so that I could understand the depth of what I was asking for when I was writing a story or when I was instructing a change even, or trying to understand from a proof of concept perspective how much work I was asking for. It became a real tool in my toolkit as I tried to develop those relationships with engineering and the rest of the organization.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's that, that sort of mental meter to know whether somebody's telling you a fish story or whether it's somewhat realistic, for sure.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's neat. So let's talk about this thing about execution and get into the nut of it. You know, I'm thinking that we all know how important it is to define objectives and outcomes as well as strategy. But can you talk about the relationship between strategy and execution, and particularly in product management, with maybe some examples from your experience?
Yeah, this is a really interesting question for me, because I think a lot of organizations struggle with this as they get larger. And what often happens is strategy ends up being pushed by leadership and driven much more top level, and then execution is left, what I'll say is sort of like the underbelly of the organization, where now that the strategy is set, the rest of the organization needs to kind of step in line to match up to that execution and be able to push that forward. And I think that this is a major breakdown of how it's actually meant to work. That strategy and how that strategy gets developed, it needs to be malleable and flexible as execution starts to move forward. Because you can have the most perfect, eloquent strategy that can be absolutely impossible to execute on. And so there isn't really a winning formula there. And I think that that's a mistake that I've seen many, many times. And so what I've tried to do is find ways to correct that. And so I do believe that, you know, setting strategy can be done with a lot of cross-functional teams involved, with a lot of conversations about why that North Star is so important. You know, I think I've talked to you guys before about my obsession with the moon and what it means to get to the moon. And so I often call that, like, what is that moonshot and how are we going to get there? And what's the plan? Who's building the rocket ship? Bringing the organization along from a strategic point of view actually helps everyone feed in executional requirements into the strategy. And so it is like top down and then bottom up to sort of meet somewhere in the middle. And keeping the two separate ends up in a really what I would call unfavorable position. And so I can give you multiple examples of this, but what I'll do is I'll use one in particular. We were working with a client on, and they're in the private membership luxury hotel business, and so very, very elite. And the idea that they wanted to strategically connect different verticals in their business so that things like single sign-on were possible, that, you know, earning rewards or earning accolades for different actions across different areas of their business would be great. That they wanted to be able to push towards a strategy that if a end user was to log in on one platform, that the rest of their platforms would connect end to end. And, you know, what this did for them strategically was be able to track one user through these different lines of business and ultimately different P&Ls, and be able to know the real lifetime value of one user, and that the data would actually ultimately help them to be able to better target that user. And, you know, I say that strategy and I think, like, yeah, of course that makes complete sense. And so this strategy got set, and the plan was to sort of move towards that, except that there wasn't any executional components included inside of the layout of what that strategy was. So, you know, if they're going to become the, you know, ultimate luxury brand and creative membership club, then there needs to be the capability of executing against that kind of strategic vision. And that would include things like not everyone was on the same system. You know, Salesforce was on one and a different CRM was on another, and there was no single sign-on capabilities, and the tech on one platform was like incapable of moving to the same databases as the techs on the other platform. And so, you know, you look at something like that, and there's a great example of strategy in isolation cannot be executed. And so the investors loved the strategy, the board loved the strategy, everyone signed off on the strategy. And when it got down to the tech team was like, yeah, no, this is impossible. And if you had come and asked us, we would have told you that you can't execute on this. Now, can we build you a 5-year plan to do that? Yes. But I think something like a 5-year or a 3-year timeline is an important caveat to any kind of strategy when you're talking to, you know, board or senior members in your organization. So I've seen it done many, many, many times the wrong way. And also, you know, I think a lot of people assume that they're good at writing strategy and that they're good at really locking in on it. And so it's another craft that really does need to be honed so that you can kind of get to a spot where a strategy is actually also attainable, but also idealistic. It's a very fine balance.
Yeah, that's neat. That's, you know, it's interesting. Maybe I'll come back to this later, but it's almost, as you said at the beginning, like there's this a hierarchy of strategy and execution, and there's kind of a boundary in between, and that there needs to be much more engagement and collaboration around that, you know, to really define something that can be effective, right? And especially in these, you know, in agile environments where, you know, having a strategy, a 5-year strategy is like almost unthinkable, you know, because stuff changes, right? And, and so, you know, you have to be an organization that can be much more nimble than that and adapt, right? So let's go back to, I want to go back to part of what I asked was, is it more about outcomes then? And then we can talk about, you know, how you actually kind of put together the strategy execution. But where does it kind of start?
Yeah, I mean, outcomes. It's a very timely conversation for me on the outcome side of things. You know, there's a great quote. It started with Marshall McLuhan. He talked about, you know, the tools that you use and that you behold ultimately come back and behold you. And I might be butchering that quote, but when the tech age was kind of born, it morphed itself into a quote from someone somewhere, some super smart person that said, "What you design designs you back." And when we think about outcomes, I often kind of come back to, are we measuring and are we owning and being accountable to the right types of outcomes? I think that's a really important part as you start to balance strategy and execution. And so I often get into arguments with people about Agile as a result of this very thing. You know, what are you measuring as outcomes in the Agile process? And I tend to lean towards much more hybrid processes so that we can make sure that we're measuring the right outcomes against, you know, testable code we can push into production and, you know, features that we are willing to ship as, you know, EUPs or MVPs or whatever acronym system you're working on. But it's really the idea that those outcomes are tracing the right measures of what productivity is towards that execution. And so, you know, I've had lots of conversations with people about, you know, should you measure velocity? Well, I don't know what really measuring velocity gets someone these days, because if all of that it is the number of stories you've accepted, then you're going to end up with, you know, corners being cut. And how do you really know? And how connected is your PM team to what code goes in actually into production? So there's a lot really to think about as it relates to outcomes. And so my advice is always to sit back and say, what does success look like? A lot of different organizations use different structures for that. We currently at Sensibill use OKRs, and OKRs are helpful for us to define successful outcomes in smaller pieces. And so I would definitely stress that anyone who's highly focused on being a company right now that is primarily executing. And to be honest, if you're a company that has survived what's going on in this pandemic right now, and if you're not thinking about execution daily at this point, I don't know how you're going to survive on the other side of this. So I would say, you know, what you design designs you back, and make sure you spend as much time on those outcomes as you do on the strategy, because they are going to go hand in hand.
Right, right. And that sort of takes us back to the North Star, right? If you don't have that North Star clearly articulated in a way that everybody in the organization can align around it, then it's going to be really difficult to you know, execute in support of that direction, right? Everybody's trying to do the best they can do, but if they're not clear about which direction we're going, then it creates a lot of friction for sure. Yeah, and wasted energy, I guess. Yeah. So welcome to everybody on the line. If you're just joining us, this is at Product AMA, Ask Me Anything, and we're talking to Amber Foucault from Sensibill. And you can ask your questions for us in the chat window. Please do. Please keep those questions coming so that we can get on to some of the topics that you as participants are most interested in. So I see a lot of product teams, Amber, struggle with prioritization. And I'm wondering if that's part of the issue in getting sort of the right things done. Why do you think execution is a challenge in many organizations and product teams?
Yeah, prioritization, if you are, I think it doesn't even matter what size of organization you're working at, prioritization is a challenge. And it can be that because of changing landscapes, because of changing technical teams, because of things like an unexpected pandemic that comes up. It really changes prioritization. I would say that, in an organization like the size of Sensibill, that, we also struggle with prioritization, and we also have to put rules in place to make sure that we all understand why prioritization is important. And I say like rules, like very cautiously. I think they're guidelines for us all so that we understand prioritization measures. One of the things I will say is that in smaller organizations, like I talked earlier about that difference of strategy being top down and execution being bottom up, and it having to struggle to meet somewhere in the middle. I don't believe in operating that way. I want to be a part of the execution conversations. I want to know why there's execution problems. And so from a leadership standpoint, I would say like the best thing to be able to do to help with prioritization is to keep those connections with your teams and to really enforce efficacy on things like stand-ups and immutable sprints, and protecting the teams as they go through things like sprint planning, and of course like backlog refinement, so everyone understands where you're trying to go in terms of an end state or completed state. And so prioritization will remain difficult, but it's what guardrails you put in so that everyone understands that when it comes time to introducing a new direction, that they know what questions to stop and ask. Why are we doing that? Where is this coming from? What do we do with the rest of this sprint? Are we meant to break our sprint? Should we be thinking about going back to planning? Like those types of questions now make people stop and wonder whether or not they're calling the right priority, or whether or not they even understand that what they're asking for is a priority shift. Because I think that's another important piece of it, is that not everybody knows that a question or an ask is a true shift in priority. So you would have to almost say, and how long will this take you? And when would you expect this to be done? And what do you think you need to know about this ask in order for it to make it onto your to-do list this week? So I think a lot of it comes down to understanding what questions to ask and understanding the impact of what you're asking for.
Yeah, that's nice. It reminds me of two things. One is I think it was Steve Jobs that said he was just as proud of all the things he didn't do as the things he did do, because it was really important to be able to say no to lots of things, right? There's always going to be more things than we can possibly do in this physical world. And so it's really always a question of prioritizing and deciding, okay, there's a whole bunch of stuff that we're not going to do. So, and you're right, the criteria for that is often not either well understood across the organization, or it shifts dramatically. So, the old story about your CEO who wakes up from a dream one morning and has a change in objectives or strategy, but forgets to tell everybody about that, right? So, it's all about communication, as you said. Yeah, you've got to be constantly communicating and collaborating and reinforcing. Yeah, these are the outcomes and the North Star and our objectives, and here's our strategy. And if stuff changes, then we all put our heads together and figure out what that means, right? Yeah. Nice. Just again, to all of our participants, please ask your questions in the Zoom chat. We're talking to Amber, and if you have questions for us, please put those in there and we'll get to them shortly. So you've launched a lot of products, it sounds like. I would say you're a veteran or a pro, and you've probably learned a lot of things, right? So what have you learned about execution from launching all those products? And then maybe you can talk a little bit about whether there are key principles or some kind of best practices that you found for getting things done.
This could be a whole hour on its own of sort of what I've been able to learn from it. I know one of the most important things is finding a really good rhythm with your team. And, I think first and foremost, investing in those relationships and investing in understanding what's important to individual players on the team is going to ultimately help you form a cohesive unit. And if you're under pressure to execute, as in you've got, aggressive timelines, which, to be honest, I don't know who doesn't, this becomes infinitely more important, because someone needs to understand the context of a Slack message, of now a Zoom call, of how you speak about something in a meeting. And those, as much as those are, seem like really small things, they're truly not. They become a really important part of your communication process and flow. And if you're in the thick of execution, you can't have something like, those types of communication barriers getting in the way. So I would always spend time on that portion of it. Let your team know who you are, be honest, find rules of engagement with each other so that communication is clear. Understand what it means to do a playback with someone, so that, people understand that when they say something to you, that you repeating it back to them is an important part of closing that communication contract. Those types of things. So I will say that, and I'll say it because a lot of people don't acknowledge it at the same rate that I think I've had to do, because I've had to switch teams so many times and work with different types of individuals, that this becomes a really important part of that. The second thing is, and I know that I constantly come back to this as the unpopular opinion, but Agile will sink you if you're trying to execute in a organization that doesn't have incredibly strong organized players, from engineering through product management, DevOps, security, you name it. If you're a function that commits somehow to that code, you need to be incredibly tough to run a full pure Agile organization. And I'm not saying that some people can't. I'm sure that there's going to be lots of people who tell me we're great at it, and that's good. I haven't seen it work effectively in all of those products. Not a single one of them was pure Agile. I really believe that setting at the start of a build what the definition of done looks like to everyone on the team helps them move towards those milestones and goalposts, and it helps keep stakeholders apprised. It helps keep the rest of the organization understanding. It adds transparency to the work. It helps keep everyone honest. It helps you prioritize and make better decisions about where to spend your time. So from a PM perspective, I would say I'm a hard pass on a pure Agile environment, and it doesn't have to be waterfall by any extent, but I firmly believe in timelines. They are very, very close to my heart in terms of making sure that execution becomes possible. And you'd be remiss to say that a good engineering partner on the team isn't extremely helpful for that. I always say that the VP of engineering is my partner. We're attached at the hip. Our successes are linked together because we both have to be able to have our eye on the prize. And there's different levers that both of us have to pull inside of each side of our organization in order to make sure our execution is a possibility. And so that also becomes what I would say is a pretty big key to success.
Yeah, wonderful. I love it. I'm curious about your thoughts on the importance of a learning to an organization. I mean, one of the things that we have valued in the shift to a more iterative or lean approach is that our competitive advantage doesn't necessarily come from our products per se, but really from our ability to learn faster than anybody else. And so if you have a 2-week sprint, yes, you want to define what's done in that, and you can iterate based on your learning from that. But how does that impact sort of longer term planning or objectives?
Mm-hmm. Well, so learning is really close to my heart. I think the only way I've been able to be successful in any of this execution is by constantly learning. And so I fully agree, and great point actually. Thanks for bringing that up. I am a big believer in learning. Just like anything else, learning needs constraints and parameters. What are we looking to learn here? And what are we willing to sacrifice in order to learn that? And I think that too often, there's an exploration that doesn't have sort of an end date or an end time, or a real like test metric associated with it. So I think learning has to be purposeful, and intentional. And then what you can do is decide whether or not, you need to extend that learning period, whether that learning period brought you what you needed. There's, learning to be had in setting learning constraints, as funny as that may sound. So I do think that that's really important. I do think like something like sacrificing a sprint for learning is well worth it if everyone on the team is aligned that this is a critical item that we have to learn now. And are we willing to sacrifice our timeline or a milestone or what we promised, the internal organization or the board we would deliver because we have to learn this piece? Then let's do it and let's commit consciously. But I think it kind of circles back to communication on what it is we need to talk about before we need to park that time to learn something. And sometimes you learn serendipitously with like a POC or doing some user testing or, doing some real in-depth market research on a potential product and what gaps there could be to fill in the market. And those things are all really, really great. I think as it relates to execution, those can be helpful in forming the strategy, and informing positioning and things like a competitive advantage. But as it relates to actually spending engineering time on more of the execution side of it, I think you have to be a lot more laser focused on how those learnings are going to be accumulated and what the plan is with them.
Yeah, I mean, the fact of the matter is when you're working with an engineering team, regardless of how big it is, it's an investment that you're making with time and skills that you can't get back. So if it's not purposeful, if it doesn't have an objective, then it runs the risk of being wasted. And I think that the tension is often, especially for product management, is in that discovery phase. You want to be a little bit open-ended to have those unexpected discoveries, as you said. But on the other hand, you have to start with a question, right? You don't just go out and start talking to people about anything. You have a question, and so that frames the purposefulness of it, I think. Yeah, that's nice. We're starting to get a couple of questions, so thank you to the participants. And let me shift to that for a moment and ask you a few things that are coming from our participants. So one of the questions is from Abhishek, who's asking, due to the pandemic, do you see a significant shift towards digital products? And if yes, do you think it's going to be a temporary shift or a permanent one?
Great question. Well, Abhishek, I have spent a large portion of this pandemic thinking through this as we try to understand our product strategy and where ultimately we want to head as an organization. I've come to the conclusion that I do definitely believe there's going to be a bigger shift towards digital products, but I think that there's going to be a new trend in what those digital products are. And if I look back sort of at the last 5 years, there's been a massive trend around convenience, products that are digital products that are highly focused on convenience. So, you think of Uber, any share programs, food delivery, anything that essentially saved you time, right? Being Jiffy, being able to order a handyman on a dime. And these are great services, and we've all probably used them, and their products are fantastic. What I think the shift is going to be is more around what I'm going to call essential convenience. So it's going to like abstract itself out of, are we just humans who are lazy and don't want to be able to do something and spend the time on what we would call a task that's not worthy? And I think it's going to shift more towards, if we were locked down in a pandemic, if we were in a state of not being able to move through life in the way that we're used to, what would be an essential convenience? And no one has really looked through it from that lens. If you look at Uber, and maybe from a food delivery system, they could probably get away with it, but there's not a lot of emphasis there at this point in time. So I think we're going to see a lot of differences in in things like the healthcare system and how we book, handle, manage, and get access to healthcare. I think we're going to obviously see a really big difference in retail brands and how retail brands can service you. There's going to be a larger divide amongst those who can afford to do localized shipping direct to your home versus those who aren't. And so I think we're going to see a lot more on the autonomous vehicle drone situation there. And so this notion of essential convenience will become more and more important as, we humans take a closer look at our lives after the pandemic and say, if we have to go through this again, what do we need in order to be not just surviving, but thriving?
Yeah, good question, and thanks for that answer. I think we've all been thinking and listening to the pundits who are trying to crystal ball gaze, but it's clear even in the B2B space that work is going to be considerably different, and I think people's attitudes towards it are going to be considerably different. So not just the rise of tools like Zoom to be able to work remotely more freely, but that's going to have a big downstream impact on real estate that large organizations maintain, the commuting and transportation aspects of it. So, and hopefully people have started to learn through this experience that they'd actually like to not work 90-hour weeks and they'd like to spend a little time with their kids. So we're going to see some shifts there. I agree completely. Yeah. And of course there's lots of opportunity there, right? If you can understand what the underserved needs of your customer or target customer are, then you're ahead of the game, right? That's nice. Let's go back to product management for a moment. And I think it's Talwar Demanyot is asking, oh no, sorry, wait a second, one other here. It's just, they're going by fast here, just a second. Okay, Titania is asking, in your experience, how technical should a PM be? Would you recommend a PM to have a high level of understanding of the different platforms and frameworks, or maybe hone in on one or two and keep their focus there and become more of a domain expert?
Mm-hmm. I really, when I'm hiring PMs, I really look at the split between hard and soft skills. I would call those technical skills the hard skills. From my humble opinion, I think soft skills are more important. I think I can teach you the tech on the platform. If you're, depends what stage of your career you're at. If you're just entering product management, I would say go for the generalist approach, understand basic languages, understand the differences between monolithic and microservice backends, really get a good handle on native versus hybrid and how different platforms interact with each other and what the limitations are. So I would be a generalist if I was just coming into my career. If I was 1, 2, 3 years in, at that point you should consider going deeper on a platform you're working on. So you should be able to have the right types of technical conversations on a product you're owning and working on, but it's too hard to anticipate where or what you could be doing prior to being in that role. So like as an example, at Sensibill, we use SDKs, native SDKs. I've never built or worked on an SDK before. I don't think it's going to be impossible for me to sort of figure it out, but I also don't think it's criteria for me to be successful at doing that. So at some point, it's me understanding what are my native restrictions, what are the components of an SDK, how would I go about dropping that into banking or FI code, what's the security like? So you're going to have to go fairly deep as you get into a particular product. And so, as you get further along in your career, you'll know sort of how to juggle that a little bit better. But at the start, just stay really general.
I like that. Yeah, it's kind of the way I went to school. My freshman year was at a liberal arts college, and it was because I didn't have a clue what I wanted to do. But I took general humanities and liberal arts and stuff like that. But it was great because I got to discover a bunch of things that really charged me and got me excited. And so then as I started to see where I was interested and what kind of things were really great opportunities, then you start to specialize. Yeah, nice. That's great. We have so now back to where was it? Demiot, yes, Tawar. So Demiot's asking, a legacy product might have a plethora of features. While reworking product roadmaps for a legacy product, what metrics would you use to evaluate and decide upon what features to drop?
Yeah, it's I hear legacy platform and I get a small twitch in my shoulder. You know, I've had to deal with enough of those to know that there's going to be no easy answer or silver bullet on this one. What I will say is it really depends on your feedback loops on those features. So so for an example, in Sensibill, we're B to B to C. And so I rely on the financial institution to update their SDK, which includes our backend release, at their own doing. So I can't really force it. So my feedback on features is actually quite delayed, because they could essentially stay on an older build for much longer, and therefore I don't actually know whether that feature is getting the same usage and engagement that I expected, or whether people are approaching it in the way that we anticipated. And so what I would look at first is how accurate is your feedback loop, and how much can you trust it. And if you've got a great feedback loop, then what I would look at is you know, your maintenance time. I would do user research, make sure that people are actually using it and they're using it the same way you intended it to be used. You know, and also I tend to think of each feature like an ecosystem. So what support is required for that feature to be productive? So is there like a customer service team? Is there a sales team? Is there someone from DevOps who also needs to constantly be monitoring it? And I would use those things at a cost-benefit analysis to help me understand whether or not we were getting what we needed from it.
Yeah, I love that. That's great. It occurs to me that it's also interesting or helpful, I think, to look at the life cycle stage of the product. And by that, I mean, you know, something like Jeffrey Moore's technology adoption curve, right? If you're past the majority and you're into the laggards, then it's probably time to adjust your North Star, which is, okay, we're going to harvest this cash cow for as much revenue as we can, which means we don't invest a lot into new stuff, but we make sure that the existing users are getting value out of it. And you resegment too. You look for, okay, who hasn't used this that could use it, right? So there's a bunch of opportunities there that would start to then influence, okay, which features are critical to that and which features are not, right? Yeah.
Exactly. You don't want a Swiss Army knife, right? And then,
Right.
and you know, years ago, that was very much a product management approach, was a Swiss Army knife. And I don't know if you've ever actually tried to use a Swiss Army knife, but I don't know what half of those things do. And so the analogy works for the users on your product.
Yes, exactly. That's great. So this is a question from Anka that has come up a number of times. And that's that a lot of product managers struggle with when is enough research? You know, how do you know when you've gotten to the point that you've done enough, you know, deeper market research of your customers? When do you decide to introduce new features to increase the product usage for a new demographic? Or is that usually when you try to introduce new features to introduce a product usage to a new demographic? So can you talk to us a little bit about ways, and this is actually about getting on to execution, right? So how much research is kind of enough to know, okay, it's time to build something?
Yeah, I think it really depends on the size of the feature, or, you know, the new product, or whatever sort of it is. It really does depend on it. And so we're actually going through this process right now where it is a new product completely. And so there's a lot of research that's required there. There's, you know, in our organization, because, you know, we're SOC 2 compliant and we've got different contracts with our clients. And so, and also, you know, we have multiple teams, customer success and sales and marketing, that all get touched by a new product. We have to put together a really robust business case. We have to be able to understand the costs that are associated with it, the risks. We have to be able to understand and communicate a full competitive analysis, on, on where this is going to sit. We have to have revenue projections that are associated with it. And, it does have to be extensive because, there's one thing to make a bet and to use instinct, and I'm a big believer in instinct, but it's quite another to go to the board and say, well, I instinctively thought we should spend $1 million on that, which I can assure you doesn't fly. So there is I would say various levels of how you kind of have to walk through that. If it's a feature, I would recommend doing like a simple basic quadrant analysis to start with and see if that starts to answer some of your questions. So like a quadrant analysis would be, you look at who your anticipated users are. Can you test with those users? Do you have something to show them that would gauge whether or not that feature is useful? You look at the business. Is this going to push the business forward? Is it going to help you guys in some way? You would look at the tech behind it. So how much effort needs to go into that tech to build it? What are you really asking for in terms of, additional licenses, databases, what's it going to do to the stability of your code? And of course the competition, have they got something like it? And, what are they really doing in order to sort of either like combat or produce something similar in their product? And so I would start there with that simple quadrant analysis. And if you find like you don't have, after doing that, a real good grasp of what challenges and opportunities come along with that feature, then I would keep digging and keep moving further along. But I always use that as my first base of which I start from.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. Yeah. It's partly pattern recognition. And when you start to see the same pattern occurring frequently, then you're kind of in the range, right? As long as there aren't too many new outliers that come up, helps you to understand that as well. And yeah, I love the visual of presenting, to a board and saying my intuition, says this, because it reminds me of that old, if your opinion, while interesting, is not what the data says, and if it's your opinion versus the CEO's opinion, you're never going to win, right? So you have to rely on data. Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah, that's great. So let's go back to execution again for a minute. And it often seems that product managers have to get things done, or we say they have to get things done by influence, not by authority. So what can individual product managers do to improve the focus on execution, especially not just for themselves, but also with their cross-functional teams that they're trying to get aligned?
Mm-hmm. I'm a huge believer. This is all about influence. It's got nothing to do with authority. I think there's maybe it's just the state that we're in right now with this pandemic, but I think the product manager has to remember that we're here to build stuff, and building stuff is fun, and it's what makes innovation exciting. And so if you're an engineer because you want to build. Like, there's an innate pleasure in that for everybody. And so when I get asked this question often, like, how do you create influence and how do you drive it? Well, like, go back to the basis. Like, are you having fun doing what you're doing? If you're having fun, people will notice. And I can guarantee you that people want to be around people who are having fun. And if you're having a good time and you're actually building something and you're demonstrating momentum with that execution, people want to be on board a winning train, right? A winning team. They want to make sure that their contributions to that team are not just being recognized, but being fed into something much bigger than themselves. And those are really just basic human principles. And inspiring your team by reminding everyone what their contributions are doing to that build and how you're innovating together, that's an important part of a PM's job. Like, you've got to be the coach on the bench. You're not really the player on the court or the field. So I would encourage everyone to just take their serious hat off for a second, and remind themselves that this is cool. We're living the real dream here, being able to build every single day, and let's inject that enthusiasm into everyone else's life. And it's contagious.
Yeah, and the passion too, right? Because we all want to do something meaningful and purposeful. And so if that's constantly communicated and reinforced, then yeah, it makes a big difference for everybody. I remember as an early product manager, I had a senior guy above me who, and it's a bit dated now, but he used to almost once a week would say, "We're on a mission to change the world." You know? And so we kind of, you know, it kind of was a cliche, but it actually did kind of work, you know. So so that was fun. So we have time for a few more questions, maybe. So if you're participating and you have questions for Amber, please get them in the chat window there. Here's a question from Irvi, who says, what are some of the biggest trends to watch in the fintech space? So what are you excited about? What kind of things do you think anticipate happening in the next little while?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think so. So this one is mixed with a little bit of hope for me. So I think it will go this way. I also hope it will go this way. So perhaps it's a little bit more biased. I think that banks are going to have to find a way to personalize and connect with their consumers at a level greater than what they're doing today. I believe that on the other side of this pandemic, that we are going to have, you know, we already know it'll be one of the largest global economic crises we've seen since the Great Depression. And to say that that elicits fear, anxiety, and other, you know, negative emotions in people is probably a large understatement. So when I look at that and I look at where fintech is today, fintech has, you know, done a great deal to help bridge a lot of the missing user experiences for the end consumer to what the bank is offering. And I actually think that this is going to be a real opportunity for the bank to now take those reins a little bit more tightly and find a way to make more positive connections. So the reason why I have a lot of faith in the banks is because on the other side of this, they're going to still be around and they're going to be protected. And so they're going to be one of those institutions that whether they need a bailout or not, they'll still be here. And so this is their opportunity. And their opportunity to create a connection with an end user beyond utility, because there's not a whole lot of reason to go to your bank today. It is going to be more and more important. I look at Amazon and Google and what they're doing in the banking space right now. If you're not following it, you know, Amazon's offering mortgages and, you know, Google's gotten into a debit card as well as checking. And those are really strategic moves. Those aren't just saying that they're going to come in and start eating the lunch of banks. There's transactional data associated with those things that are going to be really important to close the loop on a consumer life cycle for someone like Google or Amazon. And so if you've got these tech companies, you know, or specifically Amazon, a marketplace that's turning itself into a bank, why can't banks turn themselves into marketplaces? And it's, you know, it's a little bit of a stretch and maybe a little bit futuristic, but when you think about it, there's all kinds of ways that they could make those types of connections given the amount of data that they do have on each of us.
Well, and what you're saying makes total sense, because especially here in Canada, the banks are really a pretty rock solid foundation for our macroeconomic environment, right? And, you know, as Canadians, we kind of take it for granted, but, you know, back in the 2008 crisis, we all knew, okay, yeah, maybe we should appreciate their value a little more than we do, even if they don't seem very innovative and customer focused, you know. So if they can keep that foundation and that solidity, that stability, and build innovation on it and customer focus, then I think, yeah, you're right. It becomes a much richer ecosystem. Yeah, that's nice. So we're just about out of time. I had one more question. Oh yeah, back to execution here. Can you give us some indication of what sort of key signs should a product manager watch for as early indicators that execution is not going well? Are there some kind of canaries in the coal mine or red flags that, you know, say, hey, maybe I better up the ante on execution here?
Yeah, I mean, this is a bit funny for me because it's very timely, but you know, I always say if it looks like a duck and it quacks like a duck, it's probably a duck. And I think that I understand how obvious and juvenile that sounds, except it's still really true. And I think that too often we're told to suppress instinct in favor of data. And so this is one of those trade-offs where this is the part where you can go in front of the board or the CEO and you can say, my instinct tells me something's wrong. And then you can seek the data to support that. So I do think that it's a really important thing to use your instincts. And this is where it comes to the devil's in the details. So, actively being in Jira or Pivotal Track or whatever tracking tool it is that you use in order to understand how stories are being accepted and how stories are passing through and what's being merged to development branches and how often they're testing and what those unit tests look like being really hands-on inside of those details, you're gonna know and understand really quickly, especially if you've set timelines, how you're making your way towards them. Like open kimono that stuff when you're at the sprint review, ask for that demo, go deep on the acceptance criteria on each of those stories all the time. And that's not because you don't trust your team. Look at it as a way for you to understand and learn and be a part of really the delivery team, but make sure that you're kind of forcing that open kimono mindset, because I think that that's the best way to set yourself up for true transparency, which is what it will take to understand if something's falling off the rails.
And would you suggest that it's important to have interim milestones as early indicators of data or measurements that you're tracking, so that you do have time to make adjustments if you start to see that things are not going the right way?
Yeah, I would say absolutely. That's definitely a method that you can use. I would say it depends on the maturity of your engineering team and processes. So if you're in the earlier startup or slight grow up stages, it's probably harder to do that than it is if you're a little bit more mature and your team's used to working with one another. So I think it really becomes a function of the level of maturity of that team and how they're able to work together with you. So if you're not sure if it's that team's first real chance developing together, then I would definitely look at putting more of those benchmarks in place. And it's to keep everyone on track. It's not to sort of like watch what they're doing, but it's so that, if there's a need to pivot, that everyone sees what has been happening and you can pivot quickly together.
Nice. Okay, one last question, and that's something that you hear a lot of debate about, and that's the effectiveness of OKRs. So it sounds like you guys have, for better or for worse, learned how to work with them to get some benefit out of them. What's your sage words of wisdom about how did you get to that point where they are working effectively for you?
Yes, I'm not gonna lie, Lee. I was not a believer. I was with my pitchforks and I was like torches. I was like, we're not doing this. And to the credit of our COO, she started us out with, leadership had the first pass at the OKRs, and then we moved that out to a team level in this quarter. And it's my first time working with them. I do believe in them. I think that they offer a different type of organizational structure, especially at a time like this where we're all learning how to work remotely at the same time. I think it can be really helpful to be able to reference that on what another team is working on, because you don't have water cooler conversations anymore, or chats at beer o'clock. Those have kind of gone. So instead, you're sort of being able to reference this, oh, now I know and understand what it is that they're working on and how this connects back to me. So I believe they're going to become even more meaningful going forward, whether that's your method or another one is. So I am a believer. I do see the fault in them, because it can be really easy to get sucked into the prioritization of an OKR over absolutely everything else, when it isn't necessarily the balance or the trade-off. So it does take a little bit of getting used to the fact that it doesn't have to be the only thing in your sites, because there's still things you need to do to keep the lights on, and those can take over priority of what's set up with that OKR. So it's a little bit of personal preference. It's a little bit of trial and error. I don't think I'm perfect at them at all. I think they're helpful in guiding. But if you'd asked me that 6 months ago, I would have maybe assumed the fetal position and then just really cried about it for a little while. But here I am, a believer on the other side with COVID to back me up.
Yay. That's nice. That's nice. What have you guys found a particular cadence that works for you in the OKRs? Like, you know, is it monthly, quarterly, or weekly? Like what works and what's important?
Yeah, we're quarterly, and I think that's got a nice flow to it right now. And we've got a sprint ceremony every week together as a team. So depending on what huddle you're in, so there's leadership level, and then there's team level, and we'll roll out next quarter individual level. And so what we'll be able to do is use those individual levels at a one-to-one meeting to be able to check and see how progress is going. And so then it helps from a performance capability standpoint, which is also really nice. And having that kind of quarterly cadence actually gives you time to shift, understand, and really get used to performing on whatever those commitments are inside of that time frame.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, we're just about out of time. Amber, I want to thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a real pleasure to chat with you. And I look forward to meeting face to face when we can all do that again and have some more chats. Yeah. But thanks to everyone for joining us today. Please help us spread the word about Product AMA and share any of your feedback or future topic ideas. You can message us on LinkedIn, Rhythm, Reswant, or Mark Silver, or myself, at Product AMA. You can tweet us at Product AMA. Amber, thanks again. Be safe, be healthy, keep up the great work, and bye for now.
Thank you.
Okay.
Bye.
Follow Product AMA on Twitter and send us your topic suggestions. We look forward to seeing you soon.